It's great having you on. Now, I had you on because over the weekend you sent me a story that was very alarming. And I had seen the story in my periphery, but I didn't pay attention to the details. And it's about this story of the tale of the Brigham Young University race scandal. And you sent me a link to an article talking about it called commonsense.news by Jesse Singal. And it talks about how the media fell for a racism sham at Brigham Young University. A university paper was actually scooped by the New York Times. He says all the students did was practice basic journalism. Now, you can, if you want to, summarize a little bit about the story yourself, and then you found something interesting that I think is very pertinent for our program about how this involves scapegoating, which is very, very much at the heart of what we see in politics today.
Yes, sir. Like there are so many interesting aspects to this story. The more that you look into it, the deeper it seems to go, and it really does, I think, demonstrate some troubling and, well, I mean, for one thing we could say troubling, but another is just fascinating aspects of who we are as humans and what is going on in our world today. So, in short, the incident was that at this volleyball game, a women's volleyball game between Brigham Young University and Duke University. Now, remember that for a moment later, Duke University, right? So this is at Brigham Young University's location, so in the BYU arena in Provo, Utah. And what seemed to happen is that, according to a player on the Duke side, Rachel Richardson, who was the only black starter on the women's volleyball team at Duke, said after the game that she had racist slurs hurled at her from somebody in the crowd. Now, that would be horrible, right? I mean, that sounds awful. And I mean, you hear that immediately, you go like, geez, that sounds terrible. That sucks. But what happened after that kind of should raise some questions and some red flags because, well, first off, you know, the story kind of wildly went out of control. She told her godmother, who is a criminal defense attorney who's running for a judgeship in Texas. Her father is actually the deputy director of the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms and Explosives. And this story just gets amplified through Twitter and the Blue Check Club, of course, over there, and then starts getting picked up by big media. The New York Times picks it up. Variety of newspapers pick it up. It makes CNN. It makes all sorts of news, right? And to the point at which you see Brigham Young having to, you know, they take action. They're like, well, they start their investigation. They start even bringing down the hammer and of course making public statements. Of course, saying, this is not us. Blah blah blah. You've all the expected things you would just expect to hear from a conciliatory position in this respect. But here's the thing: the more that it is investigated, the less evidence there seems to be for it. And eventually it comes to light that there is literally no evidence that the event even happened, as in that there were no racist slurs that were hurled. And it's just kind of bizarre that is, not only is that what happens, but then, of course, it doesn't really get picked up by the news media as a result. And it takes someone like the Common Sense website, and which is run by Barry Weiss. The author of the particular article is not Barry Weiss herself, but Barry Weiss was, of course, a former New York Times reporter, and then left for various reasons about 2 years ago, if I recall correctly. And So it's just interesting to see that this sort of event can even occur. I mean, we're all aware of what happened with Jussie Smollett, and even, for instance, you'd think that Duke University would have learned their lesson after the lacrosse team incident from a few years ago, which of course has never been apologized for, and some of the falsely accused people there, of course, are still have negative repercussions from that. But I guess it gets even weirder when you start looking at what Brigham Young University did. And in this particular article on Common Sense, the thing that really stood out to me and why I emailed David the moment I saw it was that when Brigham Young University responded, it turned out that what happened was that the athletic department fingered a culprit who was not only innocent, by the way. I mean, of course, it was eventually determined through further investigation. It was like there was no evidence. He's innocent. But they picked a person to finger who was in the student section, although he wasn't a student, but was, quote, mentally challenged. And it's interesting as well that in the sources that were interviewed by the student newspaper, which you would think that, okay, well, yeah, if you're investigating a story, oh, ye big media, you'd probably go to, sources, you would try to corroborate information, you would try to get as much as you can in order to figure out what really happened and determine the evidence and so on and so forth. But, of course, they didn't do that. It took a student newspaper to do the journalism 101 part of this. But in those sources, they also said that they basically fingered this guy who was mentally challenged to, quote, appease a mob. Of course, as we mentioned, this whole story was exploded through further data. But it's just fascinating to see this because what you find is that this is a perfect example of what happens when you need to scapegoat someone. Imagine that you're in Brigham Young University's kind of position, where you're suddenly, in the need to figure out how to blame somebody. Well, this is what they did. They picked out somebody who would barely be able to defend themselves. That somebody who they could say was, this person wasn't a student. Oh, they may not even understand what they were doing. Oh, so on and so forth. But they picked a mentally challenged person to scapegoat. And did it why? Because they needed to appease the woke Twitter mob effectively and everything that was going on. I mean, does that sound to you like anything less than like severe scapegoating in the tradition that we've seen through the works of people like Rene Girard and others who've uncovered this is the way that you try to invoke peace when you have rivals getting together and trying to tear each other apart? So what do? You pick a scapegoat. You kill the scapegoat. That provides the peace. And that's kind of what happened. A relative peace occurs until, well, finally they decide that they exonerate the victim. Crazy how this is still a phenomenon in today's life.
Yeah, and it's a more inefficient phenomenon because of what Jesus did on the cross to unveil it. And so now we have these impotent attacks on scapegoats that fail to create unanimity. They fail to create pacification within the community. I mean, it's because we are literally reporting on the counter story that shows just how far the scapegoat mechanism has been destroyed by 2,000 years of Christian subversion of this logic of might makes right, all against one. And of course, the idea of selecting a mentally challenged person to appease a mob intentionally would be not even fully a scapegoating, because to truly scapegoat someone is to believe in their true guilt, right? And so when it's a cynical ploy, it's more like actual, like a selective sacrifice. You know what I mean? It's more of it's not actually unconscious scapegoating. It's a conscious kind of cynical, sacrificial bloodletting that they're attempting to do there.
Yeah, I suppose that's very much true as well. It's also interesting to kind of note that, in fact, even in your prior kind of segment or the little kind of news update segment before we got back on here, noting that in just this past weekend, we saw in a football game at the University of Oregon, an entire student section chanting, F the Mormons, and that barely made the radar of national news. But a false accusation of racism from what apparently was just supposed to be one person at a volleyball game at Brigham Young University somehow ratchets its way into, national news.
Right.
Like comparatively, it's really interesting to see the difference in effect that this has upon our culture today.
Right. It's a great point, and it's something that I think there's a sacredness to victimage, and there's
yes,
and that's a great taboo that to be broken. And if they have to manufacture a breaking of the taboo, they'll do it if it serves the cause of keeping the taboos front and center in everybody's mind, which is kind of what that story on Common Sense was going into, which is the old school approach to journalism where you actually try to get the facts and you actually care about reality versus this new school of journalism where younger journalists and so forth are saying, you know what, my job is not to look for facts. My job is to use the occasion of a news event to spin it in such a way as to shove down a coercive agenda to manipulate the public for some kind of morality play for an ideology. It's very disturbing. But we have to remember something else too, Norman, I was thinking about, is that the idea of having a press that is actually committed to the objective truth is a phenomenon that is unique to the Christian heritage of our tradition. It is Christianity which says you should give an objective truth no matter what, even if the king chops your head off. That's a prophetic tradition that goes against the typical tradition of media. Mediator, priest is where we get the word media. The priests were always the scribal kind of stenographers of the powerful, right? So now we see, because we're trying to get past Christianity by becoming into this woke stupidity, we're actually reverting back into making the media the stenographers for the powerful again, but they pretend to be on the side of the victims.